The morning of August 12, 1944, arrived cold and gray over the forests near Sandomir, Poland. Even though it was deep into summer, the mist clung low to the ground, wrapping the fields and tree lines in a silence that felt quiet, uneasy, and heavy all at once. Soviet tank crews inside their armored vehicles could barely see beyond a few hundred meters. Engines idled softly. Metal creaked. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rolled like a faraway storm. Inside one of the tanks, a young Soviet loader wiped the sweat from his hands. The air was cool, but he knew what was coming. Across those misty fields, German Tiger tanks were moving into position. For many Soviet tankers, the name Tiger carried a weight that could tighten a man's chest before the battle even began. Since 1943, stories had spread across the Eastern Front about these machines. Their thick armor seemed impossible to break. Their 88mm gun could destroy Soviet tanks from distances where Soviet shells barely scratched the paint. Entire Soviet units had been stopped cold by only a few Tigers positioned on open ground. Tank crews whispered about them the way infantrymen whispered about snipers. And now the Tigers were coming again. Inside the Soviet armored columns, commanders checked maps under dim red lights. Radios crackled. Orders were repeated again and again. The First Ukrainian Front, led by Marshal Ivan Konev, had pushed deep into Poland after the massive Lvov-Sandomier's offensive earlier that summer. Soviet forces had crossed the Vistula River and established a bridgehead near the town of Sandomir. It was a dangerous foothold. If they could hold it, they would have a direct path into Germany. If they lost it, months of hard fighting would mean nothing. The Germans understood that danger very clearly. Adolf Hitler personally ordered a powerful counterattack. German armored divisions were rushed into the area, including some of the most feared machines still fighting on the Eastern Front. Among them were Tiger II tanks, the newest and heaviest tanks Germany had built. Soldiers called them Königstiger, the King Tiger. They were massive, nearly 70 tons of steel. Their frontal armor was so thick that many Allied guns could not penetrate it at all. Their long 88mm KWK-43 cannon could destroy enemy tanks at extreme range. To the Soviet tankers waiting near Sandomir, the message felt brutally simple. If the Tigers reached their lines and fired first, the bridgehead might collapse. Many Soviet tank crews expected the worst. But something had changed on the battlefield. Behind the lines, inside several Soviet heavy tank regiments, sat a machine that many German crews had not yet fully faced. Its turret was large and rounded. Its hull looked rough and brutal, like a slab of raw steel hammered into shape for war. And mounted at the front was a gun so large it almost looked too big for the tank itself. This was the IS-2, short for Iosef, Stalin II. At first glance, the IS-2 did not look as refined as the German Tigers. German tanks often appeared precise, measured, engineered like fine instruments. The IS-2 looked different. It looked like a weapon built for one purpose only: to smash anything in its path. Its 122mm D-25T cannon fired shells nearly the size of a man's forearm. Each round weighed more than 25 kilograms. When that shell struck armor, the result was violent. Even when it did not fully penetrate, the force alone could break internal parts, crack welds, and injure the crew inside. But really, the IS-2 had weaknesses as well. Its gun loaded slowly. Because the ammunition was large and separately loaded, even a skilled crew might fire only 2 or 3 rounds per minute. In tank combat, seconds mattered. German Tigers could often fire faster and with deadly accuracy. If a Tiger crew spotted an IS-2 first, the Soviet tank could be destroyed before it even returned fire. That morning near Sandomir, both sides understood this truth. Inside the German armored columns moving toward the bridgehead, crews felt confident. Many of them were experienced tankers who had fought in battles across the Eastern Front. They had seen Soviet tanks burn before. To them, the new Tiger II felt like the ultimate weapon. Its thick armor and powerful gun gave crews the sense that very few enemies could challenge them head-on. Yet even inside those giant machines, tension was there. The Tiger II was powerful, but it was also new. Many mechanical parts were still untested in long combat operations. The massive weight strained engines and transmissions. Some crews worried quietly about breakdowns. A 70-ton tank that could not move quickly on a battlefield could become a trap. But orders were orders. The German attack began shortly after sunrise. Around 0700 hours, engines roared through the morning mist as German armored units advanced toward the Soviet bridgehead. Among them was the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, equipped with the new Tiger II tanks. These machines had only recently arrived on the Eastern Front. Their crews were confident. Many believed their tanks were nearly invincible. From inside the thick armor of a Tiger II, the battlefield could almost feel safe. The massive turret shielded the crew. The optics were excellent. The long gun extended forward like a spear. German gunners had spent years learning how to strike enemy tanks at long range. On open ground, they expected victory. But the land near Ogeldorf village was not ideal for them. Fields rolled unevenly between patches of forest and small farms. Low hills blocked long lines of sight. The morning mist made distances difficult to judge. Tanks appeared suddenly out of the gray haze, then disappeared again behind ridges. It was exactly the kind of terrain where surprise could change everything. Hidden among tree lines and shallow hull-down positions, Soviet heavy tanks waited in silence. One of the commanders there was Senior Lieutenant Alexander Oskin, leading a platoon of IS-2 tanks from the 71st Guards Heavy Tank Regiment. His orders were clear. Let the German tanks come close. Hold fire. Strike when the moment was right. Inside Oskin's IS-2, the air smelled of oil, hot metal, and sweat. The gunner stared through the sight, watching the foggy field ahead. The loader sat beside the large shells stacked along the turret wall. Each shell had to be lifted and pushed carefully into the breach. It was punishing work. Minutes passed slowly. Then the shapes appeared. Dark outlines moved through the mist, tall turrets, long guns, the unmistakable silhouette of Tiger tanks. At first, there were only a few shapes, then more appeared behind them. German armor was advancing in formation, confident, pressing toward the Soviet lines. Inside Oskin's tank, tension locked every muscle tight. The range closed. 900 meter, 700 meter. Still, the Soviet tanks did not fire. The German crews believed the field was empty. Their tanks rolled forward slowly, scanning for targets, but seeing nothing through the haze. Then, at around 600 meter, Oskin gave the order. The IS-2's gun roared. The blast inside the turret was deafening. The massive shell flew across the field and slammed into the side armor of a Tiger II. The explosion was violent. Flames burst from the turret ring as the German tank stopped moving. Before the smoke had even cleared, the Soviet loader was already forcing another shell into the breach. The gun fired again. Another Tiger was hit. Within moments, confusion spread through the German formation. Tanks halted and swung their turrets, trying to find the source of the attack. But the Soviet IS-2s were hidden well. Only the brief flashes of their guns revealed their positions. And for the first time, some German crews realized something deeply shocking. Their armor was not safe. The 122mm shells slammed into the Tigers with brutal force. One German tank had its turret jammed by the impact, even though the shell did not fully penetrate. Another burst into flames when a round struck its ammunition storage. The battlefield erupted into chaos. German gunners fired back fast. Their 88mm guns cracked through the fog, sending armor-piercing shells toward the Soviet positions. One Soviet tank was hit and disabled. Another took a shell that smashed part of its turret. But the IS-2s kept firing, their massive guns thundering across the field. In only a short engagement, several German tanks were destroyed or abandoned. The battle near Ogeldorf became one of the first moments when the powerful Tiger II met the Soviet IS-2 in real combat, and the result shocked many German commanders. For years, German heavy tanks had dominated armored battles. Now they faced an enemy gun powerful enough to challenge them directly. Soviet crews felt it too. Inside those IS-2 tanks, men who had once feared the Tigers were now watching them burn in the fields. The psychological balance of tank warfare on the Eastern Front was beginning to shift. But this moment had not come easily. The development of the IS-2 was the result of painful lessons learned over years of war. Back in 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Red Army was not prepared for the full force of German armored warfare. Many Soviet tanks were outdated. Many others were poorly maintained. German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, combined with skilled crews and coordinated tactics, pushed deep into Soviet territory with terrifying speed. Then came the shock of encountering the German Tiger I in 1942 and 1943. Its armor could resist most Soviet guns. Its 88mm cannon destroyed tanks at distances where Soviet crews could barely answer. Battles like Kursk in July 1943 made one thing painfully clear. The Red Army needed something stronger, something heavier, something that could survive, strike back, and break the myth that German heavy armor could not be challenged. So, Soviet engineers began developing a new heavy tank, not just to break through German defensive lines, but to defeat enemy armor in direct combat. The result was the IS series. The first model, the IS-1, appeared briefly, but the Soviets quickly realized they needed more firepower, much more. That led to the creation of the IS-2, armed with the massive 122mm gun, originally designed as a field artillery weapon. When the first IS-2 tanks arrived at the front in early 1944, many Soviet crews were struck by the sheer power of the machine. The gun could destroy German bunkers with a single hit. Against tanks, the effect was devastating. A direct impact could rip through armor. And even when it failed to penetrate fully, the violence of the strike could still cripple the target. Welds cracked, internal components shattered. Crewmen inside could be wounded or killed by shock and fragments alone. But really, victory was never guaranteed. Tank combat depended on far more than raw firepower. Terrain, training, visibility, timing, and the courage of the crew could decide everything in a matter of seconds. The battle near Sandomir was only one moment in a much larger struggle, but it was a revealing one. It showed that the battlefield was changing. German heavy tanks were still dangerous. Their crews were still skilled. Their guns were still deadly at range. Yet something important had shifted. Soviet heavy armor could now meet them on more equal terms. The old certainty was beginning to fade. Throughout late 1944 and early 1945, IS-2 heavy tanks fought in some of the most intense battles of the war. They supported infantry during assaults on fortified cities. They smashed through defensive lines protected by anti-tank guns, and sometimes, when the moment came, they faced German heavy tanks in direct duels. Every one of those battles carried the same brutal lesson. No machine, no matter how thick its armor or how long its gun, was invincible once steel met steel at close enough range. One of the most dangerous moments came during the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945. Soviet armies launched a massive push westward toward Germany. The ground was frozen. Rivers were covered in ice. Armored units raced forward across Poland with a speed that left German defenders struggling to react. IS-2 regiments led many of these advances. In battles near towns like Kielce, Radom, and Poznań, Soviet heavy tanks blasted through defensive positions that had slowed earlier offensives. Their 122mm guns were not only anti-tank weapons. That is what made them so feared. They were also devastating tools for destroying buildings used as strongpoints. A single high-explosive shell could collapse walls, crush machine gun nests, and turn defensive positions into rubble. German soldiers feared the sound of that gun. When it fired, the shockwave rolled across the battlefield like thunder. Even experienced troops could feel it in their chests. It was not just a weapon, it felt like a moving artillery battery wrapped in armor. But the IS-2 crews lived with danger every hour. German anti-tank teams armed with Panzerfaust weapons waited in ruined cities, in forest roads, behind shattered walls, and inside cellars. These handheld weapons could destroy even heavy tanks at close range. Many IS-2s were lost not to other tanks, but to hidden infantry waiting for the right moment. That was the brutal truth of the Eastern Front. The deadliest threat was not always the largest machine. Sometimes it was one man in the ruins, holding fire until the tank came close enough. Tank warfare on the Eastern Front was never simple. It was never clean. It was never only about armor thickness or gun caliber. Yet by 1945, something important had changed inside the Soviet armored forces. The Red Army had learned how to combine tanks, artillery, engineers, and infantry into large, coordinated attacks. Heavy tanks like the IS-2 were no longer expected to fight alone. They moved with infantry units that protected them from close threats, and with engineers who cleared mines and obstacles. This teamwork made the IS-2 even more dangerous, not because the tank itself had changed, but because the army around it had changed. When Soviet offensives pushed into East Prussia and toward Berlin, IS-2 heavy tanks often led the spearhead of armored breakthroughs. Their thick armor allowed them to survive hits that would destroy lighter vehicles. Their massive gun could tear apart fortified buildings, bunkers, and anti-tank positions. In many cases, German defenders could hear the IS-2 before they even saw it. The deep rumble of its diesel engine carried across ruined streets and frozen fields. Then came the thunder of the gun. By the spring of 1945, IS-2 tanks rolled into the outskirts of Berlin. Streets were narrow and choked with rubble. Buildings burned. German defenders fought from basements and barricades. The heavy tanks advanced slowly, supporting infantry step by step through the shattered capital. Each shot from their huge guns blasted apart barricades and strongpoints. For many Soviet crews, the long war that had begun in 1941 was now ending in the ruins of Germany itself. And really, when looking back at those encounters near Sandomir, the meaning becomes much clearer. Those early clashes were more than local victories. They were warnings. They proved that the balance of armored warfare had changed. The Tiger was still a deadly enemy. German crews remained skilled and determined, but the battlefield was no longer one-sided, and the old fear no longer belonged to only one side. By the spring of 1945, Soviet heavy armor was no longer entering battle under the shadow of German invincibility. That change had been forged through years of destruction, adaptation, and hard lessons paid for in blood. And really, one of the clearest signs of that transformation had appeared much earlier on that mist-covered morning near Sandomir. Looking back at the clash near Sandomir, it becomes clear how important those early encounters truly were. They proved something that many tank crews on both sides had slowly begun to understand. No tank was invincible. The Tiger was still a dangerous enemy. German crews were still skilled, disciplined, and determined. Their guns were still deadly. Their armor was still formidable. But the battlefield was no longer one-sided. Steel was now meeting steel on more equal terms, and that mattered far beyond one field in Poland. On that morning in August 1944, when Soviet tankers watched the silhouettes of tigers emerging through the fog, many of them expected the same old story. They believed those German machines might break them again, just as German heavy tanks had shattered Soviet formations before. They had heard the stories since 1943. They had seen what an 88mm gun could do. They knew how entire Soviet units had once been stopped cold by only a few Tigers placed in the right position. The fear was real. The memory was real. But this time, the old script did not hold. Instead, the thunder of the IS-2's 122mm gun rolled across the fields, and the Tigers began to burn. That image carried enormous weight, not just tactically, but psychologically. For years, German heavy tanks had stood as symbols of battlefield dominance. To many Soviet crews, they represented the nightmare side of armored war, machines that seemed to kill from impossible distance and endure punishment without breaking. But near Sandomir, and then again across the long offensives that followed, Soviet crews saw something different. They saw German heavy tanks struck, crippled, abandoned, and destroyed. They saw that even the most feared armor in the German arsenal could be broken by skill, position, timing, and overwhelming force. But really, the significance of the IS-2 was never just that it could duel a Tiger. That is only part of the story. What made it so important was that it fit the way the Red Army had learned to wage war by the final stage of the conflict. It was not simply a heavy tank. It was a breakthrough weapon. It could destroy bunkers. It could crush fortified strongpoints. It could blast apart buildings turned into defensive nests. It could support infantry in city fighting, where every street became a killing ground. And when enemy armor appeared, it still carried enough force to strike back with terrifying violence. That is why, throughout late 1944 and early 1945, IS-2 regiments became part of some of the most intense operations of the war. They moved westward with Soviet offensives through Poland, into East Prussia, and eventually toward Berlin. They crossed frozen ground. They advanced through burning villages and shattered roads. They entered cities where Panzerfaust teams waited in shadows and cellars. Every kilometer was dangerous. Every street corner could become an ambush. Yet the IS-2 kept appearing at the front of these assaults, not because it was indestructible, but because it could survive, deliver crushing firepower, and keep moving when the attack had to go forward. By the time Soviet forces reached Berlin in the spring of 1945, the heavy tank crews who rode inside those machines had lived through the full arc of the war. Many of them had entered the conflict when the Red Army was still reeling under the force of German armored warfare. They had seen Soviet machines burn in 1941 and 1942. They had watched German panzers cut deep into Soviet territory. They had learned, painfully and slowly, what modern mechanized war required. And now, in the ruins of the German capital, those same Soviet heavy tanks were advancing street by street, blasting apart barricades and strongpoints as the war closed around the last defenders of the Reich. There is something deeply symbolic in that. The war that began with German armored columns driving eastward had ended with Soviet heavy tanks smashing their way into Berlin. And among those tanks, the IS-2 stood as one of the clearest signs that the balance had changed. Not because it was perfect, it was not. Its gun was slow to reload. Its crew had to wrestle with massive, separate loaded ammunition. In a duel, a faster-firing enemy could still be deadly. Hidden infantry with close-range weapons remained a constant threat. Mechanical limits still existed. But the point is this: the IS-2 did not need to be perfect. It needed to be powerful enough, survivable enough, and present in large enough numbers within a better coordinated army to help carry the offensive forward. That is what had changed by 1945. The Red Army no longer relied on isolated courage alone. It had learned to combine tanks, artillery, engineers, and infantry in a way that turned heavy armor into part of a larger and far more dangerous system. The IS-2 became deadly not only because of its 122mm gun or its thick armor, but because it operated inside an army that had learned how to use it properly. So when we return in memory to that gray morning near Sandomir, the image feels even more powerful. Mist hanging low over the fields, engines idling, crews waiting inside steel hulls, unsure whether they were about to face another disaster. German Tiger II tanks moving forward through the haze with confidence. Their crews believing in the strength of thick armor and the long reach of the KWK-43. Then the hidden Soviet guns opening fire. The first violent hit, the first burst of flame from a turret ring, the sudden realization spreading through the German column that their armor was not safe, their machine was not untouchable. Their enemy had changed. And once that realization took hold, the war on the Eastern Front was never quite the same again. The Tiger remained feared, it remained deadly. But fear was no longer enough. The battlefield had become harsher, closer, and more equal than before. The Soviet crews who once whispered about Tigers the way infantrymen whispered about snipers were now watching those same machines burn in the fields of Poland. That shift in belief, that collapse of the old aura of invincibility, mattered almost as much as the wrecked tanks themselves. Because in the end, armored warfare was never only about steel thickness, gun length, or range. It was also about confidence, about who believed they could survive the first shot, about who trusted their machine when the fog opened and the enemy appeared. Near Sandomir, that confidence began to move from one side to the other, and that is why the battle still matters. Not because it was the largest clash of the war, not because it ended the conflict by itself, but because it marked a moment when the old order of tank warfare on the Eastern Front began to crack. On that August morning in 1944, many Soviet tankers expected history to repeat itself. They expected to see the same steel monsters advancing out of the mist, the same deadly guns, the same fear. But this time, history answered with a different sound. The deep, brutal thunder of the IS-2, and through the fog, the Tigers burned. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment, give it a like, and subscribe for more.